So my title this morning is Just Who Do We Think We Are? Humility is a crucial value for our time. And a little bit of synchronicity. I was so worried about the time change this morning. I set several alarms, and I was in my car early. So before I left the driveway, I'm flipping through this stack of CDs. I usually play the one or two that are on the top. And I found this old Peter Mayer CD that I hadn't listened to in a while, and I pop it in, and I'm driving down the highway, and here's this song, and I was like, oh, that used to be one of my favorites. And oh, it's about who we are. And isn't that perfect? So there you go. You got to hear that song. And what I want you to hold on to as we plunge into this sermon about humility is this connection to everything else that is. We are part of the clouds and the rocks and the mountains and the waves and the rivers, the planets, the atoms. And they are glad we are here. That's kind of they don't have feelings the same way we do, but it's a nice thought that we do something that none of the rest of creation does. We human beings, we see, we perceive. There are probably others who perceive differently than we do. We know that. But they're glad we're here. They're very happy that we came. And I want you to hold on to that, because that's not the whole story of who we are. The title, Just Who Do We Think We Are? And then we go into humility, is perhaps not the most inviting title for a talk. The first part of it probably evokes some voice buried in your subconscious or conscious mind. Somebody saying, who does he think he is? Who does she think she is? Who do they think they are? Or who do you think you are? It's usually when you hear those words, we assume there's some negative judgment going on in the speaker's mind. It can tend to be dismissive. You are, the answer implied being, you are nobody in this conversation. How dare you speak up? It's not really a move to engage with curiosity or compassionate understanding of the one we're talking of. It suggests that that person or those people in question have misunderstood their place or their proper status. It's sometimes even a direct charge of a lack of humility in that person. Traditionally, it's meant to be a put down. But I want this morning to think about it literally. And I want us to think about it especially in terms of we. Who do we think that we are? Because I am convinced always that we are in this together. And that we that I use is very elastic. It's we, you and I. Charity. We did that song, and how nicely we fitted into that service. And we got to use 666 too. So there's that we, and then there's the we here in this room. And there's the we that is all the UU congregations gathered this morning in different places. And there's the we that is all people who gather for worship at different places and times in different ways all over this world. And there's the we that is the people who don't pause to worship, of whom we are a part also. So there's we is an indeterminate kind of thing, and think about it as you will. So I want to try to rescue that who do we think we are question. But then I'm throwing in the word humility. And that's a difficult word. And I'll admit it's especially difficult, I think, for feminists, because it's tended in many cultures to be a characteristic that is expected or demanded of women especially, and often with very harsh judgment attached to the lack of humility in women particularly, in ways that it's not attached to a perceived lack of humility in men. So humility kind of makes my skin crawl when it's used often. That word also tends to bring to mind the idea of humiliation. And the two words are closely connected, as you might guess, from how they're spelled and how they're used. And humiliation is defined in the dictionary as a painful loss of pride, self-respect, dignity, honor. And it's also connected to the word humility and humiliation. Both are connected to the verb to humble, which carries with it. To humble is something that is done to someone by someone else or something, some circumstances. And it means to destroy someone's independence, power, or will. According to, this is the dictionary definition. I read it and went, whoa, that's heavy. And these are not good things. The lack of dignity, the malformation of somebody's dignity, or the destruction of their independence and their power, these are not things to which we aspire. But I'm still going to try to rescue humility as a crucial value for us to explore. The dictionary definition, the very first one, the dictionary definition of humility itself is the condition of being humble. So, of course, then I go and look up the word humble. It's an adjective, and it's an well, it also is used as a verb, as I just mentioned. But as an adjective, it's an interesting jumble of meanings, and there's a lot of different synonyms listed. Here are some of them: meek, submissive, subservient, low, ick. But there's also not proud or arrogant, unpretentious or unpretending, modest. Again, I kind of go ick because modesty has been especially attributed to women or imposed upon women. But it can also mean having moderate estimate of one's merits or importance, having moderate self-regard. It can mean being free of ostentation. It can mean having regard for decency. And again, here we get into trouble because decency, and this is where you kind of get, oh, it's really important, especially in the way women choose to dress. And I kind of go, ick. But decency could be constructed in a way that's positive. And this, in being modest, means you pay attention to that. You pay attention to how what we do and say and how we act impacts other people and our relationships. That's not necessarily a bad thing. But what really interests me is where this word humble comes from. And ultimately it comes from the Latin humilis, which means, according to the dictionary, lowly, insignificant. Okay? Literally, it means, in the Latin word, on the ground. Okay? So, think somebody who's been put down, knocked down, put in their place maybe. But the root of that word is humus, H-U-M-S, not to be confused with what you eat, that's made out of chickpeas. But this is humus that is soil, it is earth. In modern English, it's actually the dark organic material in soils produced by decomposition of vegetable or animal matter and essential to the fertility of the earth. This all starts to sound a little more promising to me. But it occurs to me after wandering through all these dictionary definitions that with such a wide range of definitions, overtones, and associations in play with the word humility, it's probably important for us to pay attention when that word is being used, especially when it's being used prescriptively, which I will admit my title does. I'm saying we should cultivate humility. So I'd like to choose carefully, although I hope not randomly, from among this buffet of options for meanings and associations with this word, humility. I want to argue that humility is a crucial attitude for us to cultivate in this time of discouragement, this time of Me Too, this time of disappointment with many of our leaders, this time of environmental crisis, this time of fill in the blank. Fill in the blank. If we sat down with blank pieces of paper, we could all fill them with descriptions of what this time is. And I'm going to say that I think cultivating humility can help us navigate all those ways that these times trouble us. But I want to be very clear that I do not propose that we understand humility as having anything at all to do with humiliation. Nothing at all to do with the loss of dignity or self-respect. I do not mean here an attitude of self-effacement or submission or being or feeling inferior. Instead, I'd like to build or grow, if you will, an idea of humility from the ground up, from the ancient Latin root of the word for earth. Humility, then, is above all about being grounded. The presence of humility is essential to life, growth, fertility. Understanding someone or something to be on the ground perhaps can lead us to the idea of inferiority, like it seems to lead the dictionary definitions. And it does that if we unthinkingly accept common cultural biases, the ones that sound something like this. Lower is always worse than higher. Ground, earth, matter is less important or less good than heaven, spirit, intellect. Striving to get ahead of someone else, to succeed at the cost of someone else's failure, to rise above someone else's level, is laudable. It's the definition of success when you achieve it. We can, however, choose to push aside, set aside, question those cultural biases, and choose to understand humility from the ground up, as standing in our own connection to the ground, literally and figuratively. This is humility, I think, in the sense of a modest opinion or estimate of one's own importance or rank. And by modest, I mean moderate, balanced, unpretending. This is an eyes wide open. Who am I? Who are we? Kind of humility. In other words, true humanity is simply the art of knowing who we are. Self-knowledge without striving to be or appear to be better or worse than we are, or than others are. It is, I think, akin to the searching and fearless moral inventory of the 4th step in 12-step programs. This isn't to discount the possibility or desirability of becoming better, but it is an accurate assessment of our starting point, or the point right now where we start. Our current position, our state of being. Humility is reasonably accurate self-knowledge. And I sort of felt like I had to, qualify that as reasonably accurate, because human knowledge is always incomplete and provisional. I mean, except for those of you who are really young, how many different versions of dietary guidelines have you lived through? All of them backed by hard science, right? So we're always changing how we understand who we are and how we interact with the world around us. But humility, I'm going to say, is about who we think we are. Really, truly, it is about that. And since the truth of our lives can be both delightful and painful, courage and curiosity are important allies and strategies. So who do we think that we are? As I alluded to earlier, there are lots of different possible levels to explore here. There's the individual self, and that self in relationship to the world or to spirit. There's human relationships of twosomes and families and friendships and groups of friends. There are institutions and communities, your church community, your work community, your the state of Tennessee, the voters who elect representatives who go and make laws in our names. There are institutions, communities, and there's also humanity itself as part of the larger community of beings. And it's difficult to separate those all out because we're all of those things at once. And also the way we understand who we are and how those other things relate to us, these other contexts, it changes really fast these days. We don't even really know what human beings are anymore. My husband's been gorging on paleoanthropology and some of the new stuff coming out. It's amazing. They're discovering all kinds of things, and it's really not the story, even the evolutionarily forward story that I grew up on. There weren't just like, oh, evolution, and there's the monkey, and then it gets a little straighter and straighter and straighter, and the head gets bigger, and we stand up, and suddenly we're Homo sapiens. It was probably something like there were Homo sapiens and lots of other other things all around at once. And it might be that if we kill off Homo sapiens, there's still some genetic material lying around that might survive Homo sapiens and be some other Homo something. It's kind of just, and in lots of other ways. I'm thinking about like the gut microbiome research that's being done. There are so many organisms that like I couldn't live without. There's like way more of them, astronomically more of them than there are of me, what I think of as me. And we're like all walking around in this body. It's kind of shocking sometimes. So it's a challenge not a challenge. infinitely numerous ways in which we can question who we think we are and grow into new understandings. Let's put it that way. And I happen to think that of the UU principles, big shocker here, the first and the seventh are really good guides in this search. The first principle being the inherent worth and dignity of every person, which we may someday, we're in the process of considering modifying that to not say person but being. Which, that's interesting, it's another shift in who we think we are and how we relate to the world. And the seventh principle is the principle of respect for I call it the interconnected web of being, of existence, of which we are all a part. Theologian and ethicist Wendy Farley, who is solidly Christian but in a way that I find distinctly unoffensive, suggests that we do well to resist, in her words, both the impulse to judge ourselves and others as guilty and the impulse to divide humanity according to some scheme by which some are right and others rejected. I think those kinds of schemes are where you get the who do you think you are? You're not in this group, get out. I'm right, you're wrong, you shouldn't speak here. This suggestion from Farley that we try not to do that, to back away from judgment, reminds me of Brian Stevenson's Powerful Where lecture at the UUA General Assembly last year. Some of you may have been there and heard it, some of you may have watched it online, or you may have heard me in earlier sermons this year, since then, talk about it. But he noted in this, it wasn't a sermon, it was a lecture, he noted how much more difficult justice work and truth-telling are made by our culture's punitive tendencies. Our need to lay blame and impose punishment keeps us from true humility, from being able to tell our stories and understand who we are and how we have been with each other. If we can't see ourselves and hear each other, it is very difficult to imagine our way forward. This ingrained tendency to divide people into guilty and acceptable is driven by our fears that we are not worthy. It is also a temptation to expend never-ending effort in the project of vindicating ourselves by proving we are better, more acceptable than those who are guilty. It's an opportunity to miss the value of humility from both ends at once. I.e., it's an opportunity to both undervalue and overvalue ourselves. Humility is an invitation to give up this project and accept with grace and compassion a realistic, modest self-concept. So while I was sort of, browsing the web, surfing the web instead of writing my sermon earlier this week, I came across a quotation which purports to be from the 13th Persian mystic poet Rumi, of whom you probably heard. I couldn't actually find it anywhere. I couldn't verify that it's actually Rumi and not just that a couple of people have said it's from Rumi, but it sounds a little Rumi-ish. And it goes this way: each one of us is a jackass with wings of angels tacked on. I kind of like this. Yeah. It's not a bad starting place. And it acknowledges that we have great potential and some serious limitations. This we can work with. We can make allowances for the jackass in ourselves and in others, and look for ways to strengthen the wings and practice rising. We are both vulnerable and prone to pretending that we are not vulnerable. Humility asks if we dare to stop pretending and instead understand ourselves as both gifted and limited. Interestingly, I found scientific studies to back this up too. There was in December, late December, there was a New York Times article by Kristen Wong entitled "Why Self-Compassion Beats Self-Confidence." And she's surveying some studies done by psychologists and social psychologists where they compared people who had or were coached in attitudes of self-compassion, defined by them as accepting both your shortcomings and your great things, and confidence, which is a belief that you are okay, you are good, the classic idea of self-esteem that we've all been trying to inculcate in our children for the last several decades. And they find that self-compassion actually holds up better in real life. And you should go read the article if you want to know. But I just wanted to point out that this is not like some just sort of wishing it were so kind of thing, but accepting that we are a mixed bag actually is starting to have some scientific evidence behind it. Humility invites us to see ourselves as neither more nor less than we are, neither more nor less beautiful and valuable than other beings. Wise folks have always aimed for this kind of moderation and self-understanding. You remember sayings like pride goeth before a fall. And I also want to point out there have been people talking for a long time about false humility, self-effacement or denial of our own power, our own giftedness. That is also dangerous. It may even be immoral. Parker Palmer, who is a Quaker writer, teacher, and activist, and he's kind of a wise guy. If you ever run across anything he's written, you might want to read it. But he has a lovely little book about vocation entitled Let Your Life Speak. I don't know that it even contains the word humility in it at all, but it's in large part what I would consider an extended meditation on the subject of humility. Palmer is eloquent on the importance of finding one's own unique path, the path of what he calls true self, the reality of our own nature, which means our limits as well as our potentials. He writes, if we are unfaithful to true self, we will exact a price from others. We will make promises we cannot keep, build houses from flimsy stuff, conjure dreams that devolve into nightmares, and other people will suffer if we are unfaithful to true self. This is true, I think, whether we are over or underestimating ourselves. I know this to be true in my own life. When I'm feeling really bad about myself, my family has a rough time. I am not fun to be with. And when I'm overestimating myself, that probably bothers my family too. I know it makes more problems out in the world for me and for other people as well. Palmer also describes a particularly interesting way in which we can be less than truthful in our orientation to ourselves and to the world. He labels it functional atheism, because he sees himself as talking largely to a theistic Christian audience. So that functional atheism label is useful for some people. I don't think it's so much useful for us here in this room, since we don't assume theistic stance on anybody's part. Some of us do, and some of us don't believe in something that might be labeled God or divine. But I think his description makes perfectly good sense without reference to divinity, and he actually doesn't refer to divinity in it. So I prefer to note it as one more form of a lack of humility, a failure to correctly estimate our importance. And in his words, it goes this way. Functional atheism, the belief that ultimate responsibility for everything rests with us. This is the unconscious, unexamined conviction that if anything decent is going to happen here, we are the ones who must make it happen. A conviction held even by people who talk a good game about God. And further on in the text, he says, ours is not the only game in town. Not only are there other acts out there, but some of them are even better, at least occasionally. We learn that we need not carry the whole load, but can share it with others, liberating us and empowering them. We learn that sometimes we are free to lay down the load altogether. The great community asks us to do only what we are able and trust the rest to other hands. Elsewhere, not in this book, but on a blog, actually it was on Being, the On Being blog, I found Palmer, again, not talking explicitly about humility, but I'm reading his words and taking them as if he were talking about humility. He quotes first from somebody I have never read before, except seen quoted by Parker Palmer, Florida Scott Maxwell, who was a psychoanalyst and therapist and writer in the 20th century. And she wrote near the end of her life, you need only claim the events of your life to make yourself yours. When you truly possess all you have been and done, you are fierce with reality. And Palmer's reflecting on what that is, to be fierce with reality, to live fully into all your days, to the end of your life. And he says, today at age 76, I know Scott Maxwell got it right. There are no shortcuts to wholeness. The only way to become whole is to put our arms lovingly around everything we've shown ourselves to be. Self-serving and generous, spiteful and compassionate, cowardly and courageous, treacherous and trustworthy. We must be able to say to ourselves and to the world at large, I am all of the above. If we can't embrace the whole of who we are, embrace it with transformative love, we'll imprison the creative energies hidden in our own shadows and flee from the world's complex mix of shadow and light. Which brings me to sort of the larger than self sort of humility that I think we need to grapple with. This is sort of the we part of my title. Because as profound as an exploration of the true self can be, our practices of humility they just must, extend beyond the individual and beyond our comfortable, or sometimes uncomfortable, local communities. UU principles and sources point us in the right direction. We talk about democracy and justice and equity. We talk about respect for other religious traditions and what the wisdom they bring to us. Our success, and here I'm talking, the we I'm using now is UU's. Our success in extending humility outward has been fitful and uneven. We have had some success and we have had failures. We've been jackasses and blessed with angels' wings. Here too we find the temptation to believe in the culture of isolation and competition and disconnection that besets all of us individually. We find here at the corporate level of our institutions and communities the misunderstandings of autonomy that plague the individual person. I want to argue forcefully, I want to declare that we are web dwellers. We are embedded, we are enmeshed, we are held in the web of all existence. And these problems that we run into over and over again in communities and systems and institutions, in our ecosystems, in the earth, in Gaia, some of us are able, I find it sort of not quite possible to do, but some of us can think beyond the earth, who can think in terms of the universe, the multiverse, in terms of physics that have started to uncover. But all of these places, we are part of all of those. And all of that part of who we are demands a fearless search for truth. And that search for truth potentially ends in delight. It often does. It often ends in awe, fascination, and gee, golly, who knew that? It also ends and needs to end sometimes in humble acknowledgement of who and what we are and how we have behaved and how we have misbehaved. It requires acknowledgement of who we could have been and have not been yet. I think this requires a stiff dose of compassion. Compassion for ourselves and compassion for the beauty and the tragedy of what is. Farley writes, "The world is not only dangerous, but also unbearably beautiful. We face the impossible task of opening our spirits ever wider to beauty, friendship, love, and knowledge, while protecting ourselves from assault and danger." That's all real, and that's really hard. Leaning into humility here, this knowing and accepting ourselves and our situation, I think to me it's clear that's the only way we get to wholeheartedness, to wholeness, to health, to hope. Farley says, again, that we should understand that when we do this, we are leaning into power, not impotence, passivity, neurotic patience, self-sacrifice, or the evacuation of our personhood. We're not leaning into those old stereotypical ideas of humility as being laid out on the ground because you got knocked down. We're leaning into something that's about standing on the ground and knowing our power as rooted in lots of places and lots of groups and lots of reality. Power, I think, is our birthright. And to know this and to embrace it is also part of humility. And it's not something we're free to renounce when the way gets tough, when we come into conflict with others who are searching for their true place in the world. I ran into a recent, late February entry on the On Being. I think I could get lost in On Being. I could procrastinate dozens of sermons just with the On Being blog. But I found something written by Miguel Clark Mallet, who I'd never heard of before. He's a United States writer and educator of color. He teaches writing, actually. And it's entitled In Defense of Back Talk. And he starts with remembering growing up, when he got some of this, who do you think you are, in the form of no back talk allowed. A lot of us heard that growing up, or we knew that other people around us heard it a lot. And he says about our time now, sometimes it sounds like cacophony. Sometimes it shouts, sometimes it interrupts, sometimes it shocks the listeners. Sometimes it's called the coarsening of discourse. But much of what jars the mainstream really amounts to a wider variety of people speaking for themselves. The conversations so often called polite and reasoned are now being challenged by the marginalized. And as with the back talk that could get us into deep trouble as kids, too often our so-called reasonable listeners pay more attention to how we tell our truth than to the urgency of the truth we tell. But no discussion about marginalized people can talk over us and still call itself a dialogue, however smooth and calm its tenor. Whatever this shift in tone loses in comfort, it gains in authenticity, depth, honesty, and legitimacy. For that very reason, the back talk of the marginalized has taken hold. And it will take more than a moralizing, metaphorical back of the hand or whipping belt to silence it. Because there are some truths that we needed to tell our parents, and which my children have needed to tell me, that can't be said politely because they aren't polite truths. They will upset the listener not because they're disrespectful, irrational, or impolite, but because they challenge that listener's self-image. We should remember that the accusations against sexual predator Larry Nassar began as backtalk and were dismissed as such. So was what has now become #MeToo, LGBT advocacy, and Black Lives Matter, and the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, and #CryptTheVote, which I had to look up as part of the Disability Visibility Project. All of those are back talk. This is still Mallet speaking. I became a writer in part because, having been punished for back talk by my family and the wider world, I realized the power of expressing a real, urgent, visceral, and previously unexpressed truth in the form most meaningful to the speaker. Hearing those truths from people whose experiences I had never remotely comprehended before, hearing them talk back to me is one of the most profound gifts I've ever received. So, I want you to remember that the universe is very glad you're here, that you're here to see the wonder and the glory and the delight and to experience the desire that is part of human life. And I want you to see that we need to have compassion for ourselves and compassion for other people and understanding, and allow people who jar our understanding of ourselves a little bit of room, because they're expressing something that is true also. And our understandings of ourselves, our sense of the ground in which we try always to humbly stand, changes. The way we understand ourselves needs to change and grow. So who do I think we are? In the words of Peter Mayer, I think we're the ones who are awake to perceive the splendors of creation. I think we are the ones who love and rage and desire. We are the ones who struggle to receive the words that are hard to hear from those among us who can help us see, in all humility, just who we really are. We are all of the above, and we are more. We are so much more. So I'm going to leave you taking some liberties with what might be familiar words by Wayne Arneson by saying, take courage, friends. The pursuit of humility is not for the meek. Take courage, friends. The way is often hard, the path keeps shifting, and the stakes are very high. Take courage, for deep down there is another truth. You are not alone. Thank you.